Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. En attendant que nos panélistes trouvent leur place, je vous souhaite la bienvenue dans cette session de l'après-midi intitulée « Ligne de front, Polymonde, Polycrise ». Alors, quand on a des polypanélistes, quand on a beaucoup de panélistes, ça prend un peu de temps qu'ils trouvent leur place. Tout le monde est installé, mesdames, messieurs, merci. Donc, je vais en profiter peut-être un peu pour mettre la table et du contexte concernant le sujet de notre discussion cet après-midi. Dans l'environnement complexe qui est le nôtre à l'heure actuelle, les conflits en particulier en Ukraine et à Gaza illustrent une conjonction entre tensions régionales et enjeux politiques globaux. Bien que ces deux conflits soient évidemment très distincts, ils sont en effet façonnés par des dynamiques similaires, telles les aspirations nationales légitimes, l'affrontement par belligérants interposés et le rôle d'acteurs externes. Alors que nous approchons les 2 ans de la guerre en Ukraine, Kiev doit composer avec le risque d'un conflit qui s'enlise et d'un effritement de l'appui international à sa lutte contre l'agression russe. Ce qui n'empêche pas l'Ukraine d'envisager de travailler à une intégration plus poussée avec l'Ouest, en particulier avec l'Union européenne. La guerre en cours depuis le 7 octobre à Gaza, avec ses violations du droit international humanitaire et les risques d'embrasement régional, est venue rappeler l'urgence d'une solution politique au conflit israélo-palestinien, garantissant d'un côté le droit à Que ce soit donc en Ukraine ou à Gaza, la communauté internationale est appelée à jouer un rôle crucial de médiation, à mettre en œuvre une approche équilibrée et constructive dans le but d'instaurer la stabilité et la sécurité. Mais le peut-elle? Existe-t-il vraiment une communauté internationale unie et engagée face à ces deux conflits majeurs de notre époque? C'est ce dont nous allons discuter dans le cadre de cette session avec nos distingués panélistes. Je vous les présente très brièvement. Monsieur Yves Le Terme, ancien Premier ministre de Belgique, Son Excellence Cyril Svoboda, ancien vice-premier ministre et ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République tchèque, Monsieur Norbert Röttgen, membre du Parlement allemand et ancien président de la Commission des Affaires étrangères au sein de ce même Parlement, Son Excellence Toita Vodo, ancienne vice-ministre de la Justice de la République d'Albanie, Son Excellence P.J. Crowley, ancien assistant secrétaire d'État des États-Unis, Monsieur Pascal Lamy, vice-président du Forum de Paris sur la paix et ancien directeur général de l'Organisation mondiale du commerce et coordonnateur des instituts Jacques Delors de Paris, Berlin et Bruxelles, James Carafano, vice-président du Catherine and Shelby Colon Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy aux États-Unis, et enfin Mark Ellenbogen, expert conseiller en politique étrangère, provenant également des États-Unis. Donc, pour lancer la discussion, je m'adresse à vous, Monsieur Le Terme, avec cette première question peut-être un peu générale et peut-être un peu provocante. Les conflits en Ukraine et à Gaza semblent en effet mettre en évidence davantage de fractures que d'unité au sein de la communauté internationale entre l'Occident d'un côté et le Sud global de l'autre. Partagez-vous cette impression?
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Tout d'abord, réitérer mes remerciements vis-à-vis du Maroc, la nation du Maroc, et aussi féliciter à nouveau la Fondation Amadeus pour l'organisation de cet événement, organisation à nouveau parfaite, et de nous avoir réunis ici dans ce panel. So to answer your question, I think in a very brief way and in a nutshell, which of course doesn't, I mean, it would deserve more nuance, but your question about the dividing lines within the of elements of, let's say, common characteristics, and on the other hand, of course, differences. I think that the common characteristic is, of course, that in both cases, as you mentioned yourself, it's an immense challenge for the global governance systems, and more particularly the UN system, in terms of the unprovoked aggression from Russia towards Ukraine, we have a P5 member, and the global community is without appropriate reaction, and you have a build-up by the Western Alliance to support Ukraine, with, besides that, I think quite a strong attempt, but also with some failures, to elaborate sanctions that would force Russia to withdraw from the Ukraine. What is a little bit different, I think, to what's happening in the Middle East is that for what I would call the non-European and non-P5 world, this is more, maybe I say it a little bit in a provoking way, but it's more or less a regional conflict. I was last week in Brazil, and a little bit before I was in China. When you talk to people from think tanks and even people close to leadership, that's the way they look at it in terms of Russia and Ukraine. It's an issue in the neighborhood of Europe. And of course, when it comes to counting the votes within the UN system, you have a dividing line, and if arguments that are exchanged. But let's say within the public opinion of these countries and within the world of decision makers, private sector, this is more perceived opposed to the Middle East as, and once again, it's a little bit provocative, but maybe more a regional conflict, an issue of the neighborhood of Europe and the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the consequences of that. The whole country is, of course, in the Middle East, where I would not call it a frozen conflict, of course, but it's a conflict that is pre-existing since a very long time, and where you have the well-known dividing lines, including in regional institutions like or regional formats like the European Union, where it's very difficult currently for the European Union to have common positions, to have clear positions on what happened the 7th of October and what happened since then. I would add that, but I'm not the only one here, I think living in Paris, Brussels, I would add that we are still very concerned by the impact of what's happening, the brutal way things have been happening in the Middle East, that we are still very concerned by the potential impact on the peaceful coexistence of communities in lots of places all over the world, particularly in Europe, but I could imagine also in other capitals outside of Europe. So that is also a difference towards the Ukraine-Russian crisis or war. And of course, what is common, also starting from the Gaza, is that this is also a very impressive testing, challenging evolution to the whole of the UN system. I leave it there. You asked me a kind of first-hand reaction on your question, and I leave it there, and I'm looking forward to continue the debate with the colleagues.
Merci, Monsieur Le Terme. Je poursuis la discussion en rebondissant sur un point que vous avez soulevé, et je vais m'adresser ici à Monsieur Svoboda. Monsieur Le Terme évoquait les préoccupations de l'Union européenne, notamment par rapport au conflit actuel, spécifiquement Gaza, mais plus largement, quel est le rôle que l'Union européenne peut jouer dans ces conflits, ou est en mesure de jouer selon vous?
Thank you. I'm also honored to be invited. And speaking about this point, you know, Ukraine is a unique lesson we went through, because Ukraine unified Europe and European Union. And what is very important for us, for the Europeans, that the unification is based on the power sharing system. We are sharing power. So that's why EU is a good example of well-functioning community. So, and Ukraine Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. But Gaza is a slightly different case. In my view, this is a part of the conflict, because Gaza is dividing the public opinion. Public opinion in Europe, you can see very huge manifestations of those who do support Palestine, and of course those who do support Israel. So, and it has to have the impact on the political scene, not to divide, but in my view, it is a new element, and it is the way how to make Europe weaker. So Europe is well functioning, but it is not power as it used to be in the past. But the conflict in Israel, between the Hamas and Israel, is different. It's a different element to Ukraine, and in my view, it will have the impact on the political scene in Europe. It will be so not so weak, but still dividing element politically. So, in my view, it is part of those who do, the concept of those who do support the conflict, because this is the part of the conflict. So, Gaza is a slightly different case.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Svoboda. Je vais encore rebondir sur ce que vous disiez pour m'adresser à Monsieur Rodgen. Partagez-vous cette même perspective que, suite au conflit ukrainien qui aurait donc unifié les Occidentaux, et notamment l'Union européenne, le conflit actuel à Gaza risque de les diviser et peut-être d'affaiblir encore plus la position stratégique de l'Union européenne, ou les capacités de l'ambition des Européens à jouer un rôle constructif sur la scène internationale?
No, now it works. Thank you for these two aspects and the two questions. A clear answer to your first question, if I agree to the analysis of Monsieur Leterme, that, no, Mr. Svoboda, you made the point that I would not say that Ukraine has unified, and you put it a little bit differently in the second remark, and with that I agree totally. It's Vladimir Putin. Putin has been so far a complete failure in everything, and he has been counterproductive in anything he wanted to achieve. He wanted to divide the West, and he has unified the West. He has contributed to new, perhaps two, even Sweden, but Sweden in the waiting room because of Turkey, 2 new member states for NATO. He has eventually created Ukraine as a nation, and he always denied that Ukraine is a nation. So he has been counterproductive also in his effort to divide the West. He has unified the West, certainly so, and NATO and the West is stronger than before. Nobody is talking about NATO being brain dead. So this is clearly the case. Gaza, in my view, is politically, geopolitically, a totally different case. I do not want to underline all a land war, as we learned them, that as they happened in the centuries before. So a big country is attacking a neighboring big country, because this big country, Russia, a nuclear power, wants to correct the outcome of history. Putin has never accepted the outcome of the Cold War. He wants to re-establish an empire. So this is a totally different situation in Gaza and the Middle East, because there, on the contrary to that, there was a regional and it was the intention and is the intention of both Iran and Hamas to destroy this process of order building in that region. And so far, the Arab countries, including first and foremost Saudi Arabia, have not given up on this regional political, geopolitical goal. It will depend on how things evolve, but I think they will stick to their policy. And there will be a day after the war, when this war has ended, which has been started by Hamas. And then I would say your question can be answered about the European role. I think that then there could be a European role, because it has become now compelling that there will not be a military solution to the conflict, that this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians can't be contained forever, and while containing that, achieving a regional rapprochement. So it has to be resolved, and by resolving this, undertaking steps to peaceful coexistence, as unimaginable it seems today in the also perhaps get out of this conflict and war more united, which is not the most important thing because the region is important, but I think contributing to a regional order, if wished by regional actors, the Europeans would be ready to work for that.
Merci, monsieur. Merci beaucoup, monsieur Rodgen. Je constate que certains nouveaux propos ont suscité déjà une réaction, notamment de monsieur Svoboda. J'y reviendrai après, je garde en tête cette réaction, notamment l'échec de Vladimir Poutine en Ukraine, si j'ai bien compris. Mais je m'adresse tout d'abord à madame Vaudot, et je reviendrai peut-être sur ma question initiale. Selon vous, donc, les conflits en Ukraine et à Gaza mettent-ils en évidence des divergences profondes dans la communauté internationale, et peut-on résorber ces divergences profondes?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very glad to be part of this panel because, rightly so, it has put forward some very interesting questions. Some questions which, of course, would highlight this difference of reactions. We had 2 years ago the invasion of Ukraine, and rightly so, the international community had a very unified and strong voice for what concerns the sanctions towards Russia, the condemnation of war. And of course, we could actually see the reaction of what is happening now in Gaza. From my point of view, first of all, still we have to make some differences here. From one side, we do have what we call otherwise the classic geopolitics. So one country fighting another country, Russia against Ukraine. Whereas in the case of Gaza, let's not forget one feature which is fundamental, the fact that the borders are not so clear. So actually, in the case of Gaza, we are actually asking, and we are highlighting especially the issue of borders. This is the big difference here. So, of course, the religious factor is the one which has put the international community a little bit in stake, and this is why we see, for example, all this vague of protests, all Palestinians to have their own country. So yes, we do see this difference, and it is important for the international community to first of all recognize the religious differences, and that there is a religious factor in these two cases. This is why I am very glad from one side that we are here to discuss these two cases, which have their similarities, but at the same time the religious feature is the one dividing them. So we have to actually think how the international community would react to this. And of course, the main question asked, especially by the Arab countries, is why there is this difference. And this is one of the questions in the panel. So Let's not forget that geographically speaking, Ukraine has drawn this attention, and of course the West was supposed to react, especially when it concerns the European continent, and this was a very logical consequence. But on conflict. So from the one side, it is a surprise that it is happening very shortly after the Ukrainian conflict, but it is still part of a series of conflicts. I would take this moment to invite especially the policymakers, the ones which still have decision-making power, to actually come forward with solutions and try to fill this gap concerning all the possible diplomatic
Mr. Cronley, earlier today we were discussing how the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza both reflected the tensions in international relations with the goal of mediation and integration and normalization. I found this discussion very interesting, and I would like maybe if you could share your insights with the audience, not only with me during dinner, about that.
I think on the surface, putting the two conflicts side by side, they don't necessarily interconnect easily. And in fact, every crisis has its own dynamic, its own set of issues. But I do think that if we ask the question, why is what's happening in Ukraine happening there, and why is what's happening in Gaza happening now, you do have a quite familiar contest over the forces of integration and normalization against those opposed for one reason or another. If you think back to World War II, for example, where the existing international order was destroyed, in the post-World War II international structure, one of the great accomplishments is European integration. One of the open questions is how far does that line move from west to east? And Vladimir Putin is saying that whether you're talking about the European Union or you're talking about NATO, that line should be drawn at the Polish border, not at the Ukrainian border. In the case of the post-World War II order, one of the gaps in terms of regionalization and integration and normalization, has been here in this region, where we did have individual steps with Egypt in the 70s, with Jordan in the 90s, and then more recently the Abraham Accords involving normalization between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. But part of the gap has been what to do about the Palestinian people and the failure for a variety of reasons to reach an agreement that would end the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis and lead to a Palestinian state. But why now? One of the features of the last several months has been acceleration of discussions among Israel and Saudi Arabia, supported by the United States, towards normalization. And Hamas may have been sending a signal, one of two things. One, that there should never be a normalization, and that normalization of relations that have occurred should be rolled back. Or the other is that there can only be normalization when there is a resolution to the question of a Palestinian state. Either way, in both cases, it points you towards the potential for a solution. if Putin is opposing integration throughout Europe, then obviously one measure of success might be to continue to advance Ukraine's position to potentially join the European Union and even to potentially join NATO. And likewise, if Hamas is sending a message about normalization, part of the answer has to be to come back to the question of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, joined eventually by other states in the region. But now we have in front of us a return of the question of normalization and how that might occur together with a renewed negotiation towards the formation of a Palestinian state.
Merci, Monsieur Crowley. Monsieur Lamy, je me tourne vers vous et ma question, va aller dans le prolongement de ce que disait un petit peu plus tôt Monsieur Rodgan concernant le rôle des Européens dans le conflit israélo-palestinien. Monsieur Rodgan disait qu'une fois que le conflit actuel arriverait à son terme, les Européens devraient se poser la question du rôle qu'ils pourraient jouer. Et je me demandais si, peut-être dans cette perspective, vous auriez des pistes de rôle, d'idées que les Européens pourraient mettre en œuvre, et s'ils devraient déjà jouer un rôle significatif, et dans quelle mesure ce rôle pourrait changer de celui qu'ils ont joué par le passé, puisque les Européens ont quand même déjà été impliqués dans les tentatives de résolution de ce conflit.
Comme les autres Européens qui viennent de s'exprimer, je considère que l'invasion russe de l'Ukraine et l'attaque du Hamas contre Israël sont des monstres qui ont surgi, dans les deux cas, à moins de 3 heures d'avion de chez moi. Et ces monstres, je les analyse comme le faisait Gramsci, quand il disait que un ordre ancien est en train de disparaître, un ordre nouveau n'est pas encore là, et dans l'interrègne surgissent des monstres. C'est mon analyse, c'est mon effroi d'Européens pour qui un grand jour de ma vie a été la chute du mur de Berlin. Donc c'est un autre monde que celui dans lequel on constate, en analysant par exemple les réactions internationales à ces deux événements ou en regardant les résultats des votes à l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies, que plus de la moitié des représentants des populations de cette planète ne partagent pas mon point de vue. Ils ne sont pas d'accord avec mon analyse. Ils trouvent, eux, que ces événements représentent pour eux une sorte d'espoir. Pour moi, c'est du désespoir. Nous sommes dans cet interrègne entre un ancien monde et quelque chose de nouveau. Et donc, de mon point de vue, la priorité, et de ce point de vue-là, je suis tout à fait en ligne avec ce que vient de dire M. Crowley, l'urgence, c'est de reconstruire un ordre international qui donne à la préservation de la paix la valeur essentielle. Ça a été le cas quand on a essayé après la Première Guerre mondiale, ça n'a pas marché. Ça a été le cas quand on a essayé après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, ça a marché, étant entendu qu'entre-temps est intervenu ce qu'il faut bien considérer comme un facteur de paix essentiel dans le monde d'aujourd'hui, qui est la dissuasion nucléaire. Aujourd'hui, ce qui préserve ce monde d'une guerre globale, ça ne sont pas les Nations Unies, c'est pas le FMI, c'est pas la Banque mondiale, c'est pas l'OMC, c'est pas l'Organisation internationale du travail, c'est la dissuasion nucléaire. Et quand on en est là, je crois qu'il faut vraiment réfléchir à quelque chose de nouveau. Je comprends très bien beaucoup des raisons qui font que les pays émergents, les nouveaux pays du Sud, pour la plupart, critiquent l'ordre international actuel, qui n'est pas représentatif du monde d'aujourd'hui, il est représentatif du monde de 1945, pas celui d'aujourd'hui. Et en même temps, je ne vois pas très bien, et c'est là que je les attends, en quelque sorte, avec espoir. En même temps, je ne vois pas très bien par quoi ils ont l'intention de le remplacer. Et donc, ma réponse à votre question, c'est ouvrons avec ces pays qui critiquent l'ordre d'aujourd'hui comme étant injuste, ouvrant une conversation en disant si décisive dans cette conversation que les Américains, que les Chinois ou que les Indiens. Pourquoi? Parce que l'Europe n'est pas une nation encore et que l'intégration économique, qui a été un grand succès de la construction européenne, n'a pas encore conduit au niveau d'intégration politique qui permettrait à l'Union européenne d'être un vrai animal géopolitique. Or, si vous voulez participer à une discussion comme celle-là, vous ne pouvez pas le faire seulement à propos de l'économie, il faut le faire aussi à propos des valeurs, à propos de la politique, mais je pense que si une conversation comme celle-là s'ouvrait, l'Europe, à cause de sa propre expérience, aurait beaucoup à dire. Et c'est une des raisons pour lesquelles je souhaite que des événements comme celui que vous organisez à Tanger, il se trouve que je fais la navette entre deux événements à Tanger, un sur la façade méditerranéenne, qui est celui-ci, l'autre sur la façade atlantique, qui est le Blue Africa Summit. Je trouve que des endroits comme celui-ci peuvent être peut-être d'inspiration pour nous. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lamy. Mr. Carafano, one of the panelists earlier mentioned that Afghanistan was a disaster. Mr. Lamy, a few seconds ago, was describing a world in chaos. Do you think that this current situation impacts negatively the ability of the international community and the major player within it, let's say the United States, to play a key role into resolving major issue, major crisis, and beyond that, to rebuild an international order that can provide lasting peace, as Mr. Lamy was mentioning?
Thank you for not asking me a Trump question. I should preface by saying that you have two choices. The rules-based order has failed miserably, or it was a political fiction to begin with. I think the reality is we didn't need the war in Ukraine or the war against Israel to demonstrate that there have been acts of brutal aggression and innumerable coups. So somehow that there was a stasis that existed before now, I just think is simply not true. I think what we saw here, and I do think that actually the war in Ukraine and the war with Gaza and Israel tell us a lot, that's the same, that in both cases, and I thought your assessment about Putin was just so exactly correct. Putin failed horribly in destabilizing Western Europe, which was the goal of this attack. And it was one of the greatest failures in history, and a failure I do not think he can recover from in this decade. But there's a second failure as well. Putin switched sides, and instead of trying to normalize relations with Ukraine, which Russia had been trying to do for years, it immediately supported Hamas against that. And we know why. Because he was hoping that the war in the Middle East would distract and divide and weaken and distract from Ukraine. And I believe he failed there too. And the reason is the same in both cases. There were nations with both the capacity and the capability and the interest that saw the importance of a free and independent Ukraine and didn't want Israel destroyed. I mean, we could say there are different views in in Europe, but not one European nation has stood up and said it's okay for Iran to sponsor or for Hamas to destroy Israel. I think that's important. And so actually I think where we are is there are two questions here. Well, The other thing, is, which is we have to point out, is none of this would happen without partnership between Europe and the United States. So the transatlantic partnership is never more relevant than ever. And whether Europe acted as a whole or European nations banded together, they acted as Europe. Probably the strongest reaction in Europe in modern history. And the United States partnered with them because if they had not worked together, there wouldn't be Ukraine today. And I think that is true in Israel as well. So the two questions are, one is, how do we both retain the capacity and the capability to act in our interests in the future? And I think there's lots of discussions there on growth, on how we deal with energy and the environment, on how we deal with the Middle East and Africa. I mean, one of the things we hear is, why is the United States and Europe intimately involved in Ukraine? Why are they concerned about Israel? Why are they not, why do you not see that level of attention and interest in Africa? And I think my answer to that is I think that's going to change, and it has to change for two reasons. One is a stable Middle East is important for all of us, and we all have a stake in that. And that is not going to happen without partnership of the transatlantic community supporting with people who want to do the kinds of things that PJ talked about in the Middle East. Because if there are people that want to do that, with the backing and support of the transatlantic community, that can and should happen. And the other is Africa, where I simply think we cannot ignore the fastest growing part of the world that potentially could be the world's breadbasket. It could be a net exporter of energy. It could actually be one of the world's great human capital hubs with science and technology. We're in decades from now, we're going to be as interested and engaged in the future of Africa as we are in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. And so where is all that going to come from? Well, it's not going to come from unless the transatlantic community is strong and growing and prosperous. And I think the question is what we want, what success is if we're good at this and we actually don't demonstrate weakness like we did in Afghanistan where we ran away, but if we actually have the capacity to stand up and support the things we're interested in, then we can be doing these things through positive engagement and working together rather than going and fighting wars to protect people.
Thank you. Mr. Ellenbogen, Mr. Carafano just touched a little bit on that moments ago. The West has been accused of double standards regarding its reaction to conflict in Ukraine and Gaza and a lot of other conflict in the past. The West to play a constructive role in the future into building some kind of a new world order?
Well, first, I'm not speaking for the US government, so let's just put that out. No, I don't agree with your comparison, and I disagree with it massively. There are countries that have standards, and there are institutions. Hamas is not a country. It doesn't have an elected government. It's been controlling Gaza for years. Ukraine has had a government, even if many of the people have been corrupt. So no, I think there are places that have standards and values and put them forward, and there are places that pretend to have values and standards and put them forward. And our problem is that we've spent too many years listening to their garbage, not preparing ourselves militarily, in security policy, in eliminating the problems of Putin and Erdogan and Orban and Kaczynski, and the list goes on and on and on, and simply accepting that we can always get them to a negotiation table, but the walk carefully and carry a big stick concept falls because we don't keep the big stick strong enough. And that doesn't have to include going out like Mr. Putin does, which I reject, and killing people outside of Russia, which he does, including friends that I've had and people I've served with, and other people who do the same. You know, people always like to compare the United States with China and Russia and with India, and minus India just at the moment. You know, if I had to pick, and I apologize to speak this way, I am after all an advisor. If I had to choose the pimp that runs our planet, it certainly isn't China. It's definitely not Russia. I would still rather stick with the United States, as naive as we can be, as the to compare what's going on in Gaza and Israel with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, I think is a failed comparison, and I'll tell you why. From the very day Mr. Putin came from Dresden and Leipzig as a KGB colonel to take over Russia, he never from day one accepted that the Soviet Union should not be around, and that includes the periphery, the Warsaw Pact. It includes Poland. It includes Czechoslovakia, a place where my mother was from. It doesn't include Germany yet, but his thinking has always been der sowjetische Raum, the Soviet space. And this is not a man you can negotiate with. He simply pretends. And we miscalculated. Days before the war in Ukraine started, and I was sent around to negotiate with people, national security advisors, lots of things I do below the waterline. 95% of my world is below the waterline. No European, with the exception of maybe Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Denmark too, wanted to believe the war was going to start 1 hour after the Olympics. That is what I said would happen. Okay, I was wrong. It was 2 hours after he left. And as far as Hamas, Hamas has controlled Gaza for 16 years. Has it increased the livelihood of the Palestinians? Because you see, Hamas has about as much to do with Palestinians as I have to do with hair. They do not look out for their own people. They do not secure their water supply. They do not secure their food. They do not secure their ability to live at a standard that they should be able to live at. And many people in Gaza, as you well know, dislike Hamas and say even worse things than I do about them. The way to get rid of Hamas is to eliminate them, which unfortunately the Israelis are doing in not to hit civilians. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen, as a military officer, I can say, when you have you sitting there in one tall building, the distance is twice the length of here, sitting in another building, and there are tunnels going under, and there's one person sitting upstairs who is the number 3 of Hamas or number 2, or there are weapons in tunnels purposely done, 300 kilometers of them, ladies and gentlemen. It is very hard not to hit civilians, and you know what? That's what they plan with. They plan for us to hit women and children. They planned for us to hit hospitals. They planned for us, and it is nearly impossible, although there are some weapons that can today kill people, doesn't make war much more fun, but it doesn't destroy all the buildings. And so this fallacy that I think comes out of the UN and out of a lot of institutions that I do not respect is not only have they failed in creating an international order, they will never succeed in doing it because many of the countries who are in those institutions are totalitarian, dictatorships, fake democracies, fake existence who pretend that they have the right to sit in the same room with a jury with your country over the last 20, 30 years, is that you've moved in directions that I respect. I would have long integrated Morocco in the European Union. I would have long integrated Morocco into NATO, and not just Partnership for Peace. And I have that same feeling about Turkey. Why is there a difference? Why are we jumping on the bandwagon with Ukraine and not for you? Partly it's Islam, unfortunately. And my wife was from Morocco. She was from Tanger. And yet, she had a much stronger opinion. And let me start with one of the things she used to tell me before she died. And that is, she was particularly disgraced by how Islamic countries treat women. That is not so much the case here. But in one of the panels I'll be on, which will then bring up China, China spends every year sterilizing hundreds of thousands of women, and they are Muslim women. Anyway, that's my answer to the question. And we cannot just sit at a table and negotiate. You have to also go after those, unfortunately, who would kill you, kill your values, and accept that sometimes to have peace, you also have to have war. My apologies. Thank you.
Merci à toutes et à tous. Donc, cette première ronde de prise de parole a soulevé pas mal déjà de questions. Je vais revenir quand même à celle que je n'ai pas oubliée au tout début. La réaction de M. Svoboda aux propos, notamment de M. Rodgen, mais aussi de M. Carafano concernant l'échec de Vladimir Poutine. J'ai le sentiment que vous n'étiez pas tout à fait d'accord, peut-être. Donc, vous laissez la parole pour présenter votre argument.
Thank you. Maybe I belong to the minority, saying it was not Putin who unified Europe. It was Zelensky. It was Ukraine, the courage of Ukraine, and unification of the nation. It was example for Europe, because we can imagine another scenario. Puppet government in Kiev, some democratic government in exile in Poland, we would see completely different scenario. So in my view, so the unifying element is the courage of Ukraine. But listening to all the contributions, one remark. So the problem is, what will be the next day after the war? I mean in Ukraine, because it is not a question of weapons, because we are still delivering weapons from Europe, but there is another problem which is also very, very sensitive. This is the human resources in Ukraine. So we are sticking together with Europe, and we are supporting Ukraine from the bottom of our hearts, my country. But still, we have to listen. We have to think what will happen the next year, because unfortunately the offensive of Ukraine was not successful, unfortunately. So this is one hidden story, because maybe it is a question of the Soviet concept or Russian concept, the survival. The Russians, they are capable of surviving, so taking the time and time and time and time. The time goes in the interest of Russia, unfortunately. And we have to stress again that also to mark description of the situation in Israel. Of course, the Palestinians, they are the victims of the conflict. Of course, one day we have to know when the war stops. When? And what will be the next day? What will be with Gaza the next day after the war? It is also very sensitive and very important question, and we have to deliver the message, the hope for people even in Gaza Strip, so that one day they could have the normal life.
Merci. Je me tournais vers Monsieur Le Terme, si vous me permettez. Concernant ce que Monsieur Svoboda évoquait à propos de l'avenir de l'aide à l'Ukraine, et notamment, quelle est selon vous, ou quelles sont les actions que les Européens, et les dirigeants européens en particulier, devraient mettre en œuvre pour convaincre notamment leurs opinions publiques du bien fondé de maintenir cet engagement des Européens aux côtés de l'Ukraine, d'autant plus important que si du côté des États-Unis il y avait un changement radical à la présidence dans un an, le soutien européen serait peut-être le seul en faveur de l'Ukraine.
Merci pour la question. Je voudrais répondre en deux volets. Je crois que I think is the question of the sustainability of the support, based on a good consensus that we have to do all what is within our reach to support Ukraine without engaging ourselves with the alliance or in any way in the conflict itself. So there I think there is at the horizon, there is the electoral horizon, there is also the daily life of nations, there is a new conflict, there is sustainability in terms of what is the political support to continue. I think within the European Union it will be tested in terms of finding consensus or unanimity by what's happening in Slovakia, in Hungary. So that is already a matter of concern, that we put all our forces together in a good cooperation with the allies, with the US, to continue to support at a sufficient level to give Ukraine the possibility to recover its territory and to regain its full independence. A second chapter, I think, of the story is, and there I think we will be confronted at a certain moment with the Commission has tabled, I think last week, a report based on which Ukraine is given the status as a candidate member state of the European Union. I would say so far this is not too risky, although I'm curious to see how the Council will handle this in December, I think. But imagine that we engage in real negotiations and chapter after chapter we make progress, and there's a lot of progress still to be made in Ukraine. We could at a certain moment be confronted with a historic dilemma that is, on the one hand, to continue the religion of the merit-based approach of enlargement negotiations, which until now I 200% supported, including in the Balkans, when it was difficult for me and for other people in my country and in Western Europe to continue to say no to some Balkan countries, notwithstanding the efforts they did, including even changing their names, to continue to say no. But then you have the other kind of approach, which would be seizing the importance for the history of the European continent from different perspectives and say, well, we will leave the merit-based track or the merit-based approach, and we will seize the opportunity to pacify and to readjust what history has, or to repair what history has broken in the 20th century. There have been examples. I think that people in the panel here, some are more experienced to evaluate this, but as a young politician, how I witnessed Mr. Rutgen and Mr. Lamy, how we witnessed Helmut Kohl not listening too carefully to some critical remarks in France and other countries and saying, well, I will do it. I do the Wiedervereinigung, even when some odds are against and when people are criticizing, I just do it. And this is, I think, still the historic dimension of Helmut Kohl and of the CDU at that moment, is to say, well, there may be 13, 18 technical reasons why not to do it and why it is risky, but still, this is a moment in history. A kind of attitude we missed until now towards the Balkans. So to end my long answer to your question, I think this is something we should mentally be prepared to face. Ukraine is a territory where war is happening, so enlargement, be it EU, be it NATO, comes against practice, against historical experience, historical practice, comes with lots of risks in terms of treaty, articles of treaty and let's say obligations we shoulder. So yes, that's for me the picture, to be prepared to face that kind of historical dilemma.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Le Terme. Je me tourne vers vous, Monsieur Rutgen. Justement, est-ce que les Européens pourraient dire non à l'Ukraine dans la perspective d'une intégration future, et sur quelle base pourraient-ils éventuellement dire non si cette solution était tout à fait envisageable?
I very much agree with what Yves Le Terme has outlined. And if I try to summarize what you've said is, this time is different. And it's different, and it's different in the direction that we have to, that you said there, criteria, and then enlargement means a prolongation of the European Union. Was it what it was before? I'm absolutely sure the question of Ukraine joining the European Union will not lead to a simple mere prolongation of the European Union as it existed before, but it will change the nature and the character of the European Union. It has to be merits-based, but the merits are different. The merit is that, as Mr. Swoboda put it, it's Ukraine, triggered by the war of Putin, that has unified again Europe and the West. It's the Ukrainians that are dying because they decided in favor of the European way of life, for democracy, for the rule of law, and for market economy. This was the threat to Putin because he was convinced, and is rightly convinced, that he can't afford this big country to become a success as Poland and the Baltic countries have become a success after and by joining the European Union. So from a geopolitical perspective, from a historic perspective, the membership, Ukraine belongs to Europe and to the European Union. This is clear. And if we were to deny that claim, we would be different to Helmut Kohl's grasp of the historic moment. This historic moment can be predicted. But it will be different because we don't have 20 years' time for that. So if Ukraine is in any aspect ready for joining, it's a big question. And if the European Union is prepared to reform itself for enlargement, it's also an open question. So my disagreement only with you, Monsieur Le Terme, is it's not a dilemma, it's a trilemma. It's a trilemma, geopolitically compelling, and the traditional requirements of preparedness of the country that wants to join and the European Union on the other side will be different than it was in the past. So what has to be decided is, what is our idea of the 27 member states? What is our idea of the European Union? It will become a new European Union, because this war, which has been started by Putin and Russia, and and Europe has been defended in this war by the Ukrainians with the support of the West. This has not started yet in Europe, and we have to start it.
Merci beaucoup. Je me tourne peut-être, Madame Vaudot, vers vous, peut-être pour avoir votre perspective sur ce trilemme que Monsieur Rodkin vient d'évoquer. Que serait, oui, désolé pour le néologisme, quelle serait la perspective européenne dans le cas d'une intégration de l'Ukraine?
Well, first of all, let's not forget that it was Ukraine which brought the agenda of enlargement back. So till 2 years ago, we couldn't even talk about enlargement because it was simply considered a wishful thinking, that's all. I do know this from the Western Balkans perspective. We're receiving just negative answers concerning the opening of negotiations. So actually, well, it is thanks to Putin that the enlargement is back on the table. So we have to discuss not only of Ukraine, but alongside Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova were part of the neighborhood, le bon voisinage, the good neighborhood partnership. So the whole idea was that there was some kind of flirting of these countries with the EU. So we do know from history that every enlargement round has actually given another shape to the EU. And I do believe that since there has been always a new treaty, whenever that we had an enlargement round, it is not coincidence that the high-level officials are talking about a post-Lisbon Treaty. So there is a need, actually, to reform the EU, and this is a common agreement among, at least in the EU bubble. This is what has been very much put accent on. So from one side, I wouldn't be scared, as it was said till starting from 2014, with Crimea, that Ukraine is a big country and we cannot afford such a great population in the EU. We could actually especially highlight all the possible benefits that this country can offer. And yes, from one side, it is true that the EU budget will be separated into smaller pieces. There will not be an increase of the EU budget, but let's see it from another point of view of with the French proposal to actually reform the EU and give the possibility of to all the countries to somehow enter in the EU according to their own terms. So a sort of EU circles where they would have to opt with different terms and conditions.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois que Monsieur Le Terme voulait réagir par rapport à ce que...
Just very briefly, I think that we should, well, we owe the public opinion, the European public opinion, sincerity, transparency, and honesty in terms of the elephant in the room, which is still today that we are talking about a potential candidate member state. We will see what the Council will decide, but where there is war, where war is part of daily life, where there is a foreign power besieging civilian citizens. And so, even far from discussions on NATO membership, this poses enormous challenges to the European Union. And I totally agree with what Mr. Röttgen and Madame Vodo have said in terms of that the European Union, of course, will have to deepen its integration, adapt it from all kinds of budgetary, institutional and other points of view, which is already quite a heavy agenda. But there is an elephant in the room, and it's about what is then in X years, in 3-5 years, if we have to speed up, what is the situation in terms of the territorial integrity in Ukraine, and what kind of precondition do we agree upon that has to be formulated in full transparency with our public opinions.
Thank you. I think Monsieur Carafano had something.
Yeah, just because I want to talk about NATO enlargement, which I actually think in the short term is more important because it comes with the security guarantee. And I think the key to NATO enlargement is not where the line is, it's when the fighting stops. Because Ukraine would certainly be eligible to enter under the same conditions as, say, West Germany did at the start, which is essentially if part of your territory is occupied by a foreign power, the conditions under which you would enter NATO, as long as you're not in active conflict, is that you would agree that you would not try to regain that territory through military means while you're a member of NATO. I think that's very doable. I think when those conditions are met, that's good. And I think there should be an effort to expand NATO into the Balkans as well. And you might say, well, why would the United States want a bigger transatlantic community when you constantly hear from the United States, well, you know, we want to shift resources to other areas, we're in competition with China, why would we want to do more in Europe? And I think as well, if you want the Europeans to do more, and you want to do less in Europe, then in NATO enlargement actually benefits that. It takes more territory out of the hands of Putin. It raises the stakes on every time he wants to threaten the NATO frontier. And even with small countries, you bring more capacity into the alliance. And in the long term, not to get too military geeky here, but the future conventional deterrence of Russia is really going to be in what's called deep strike. So in other words, it's killing stuff in Russia before it actually ever gets to the NATO frontier. Now, these are the kinds of military capabilities that both Europe and the United States can well bring to the table, and the Russians know that, as long as we don't bankrupt ourselves. So this gets to this, I want to say, to go back to Africa, this gets back to the issue of, actually, I think NATO enlargement means a more stable Europe. Engagement in the Middle East means a more stable Middle East, and that is the foundation to starting to build a more stable relationship with Africa, particularly starting in North Africa and working our way down. And it frees up more capacity and capability to do that. And why I keep going back to that, why I say it's essential, because people are, well, why aren't we showing the kind of commitment on the ground in Africa that we showed, or like that we show in Ukraine and Israel? And the answer is, we're probably going to, because our interests are increasingly going to be in Africa as Africa grows. We don't want to get to the point where we're demonstrating our fealty for Africa by having to come over and supporting people and fighting against other people. Because what do the Middle East, the war in the Middle East and the war against Ukraine have in common? They were both started by countries, not because of that land in particular, but because that was the key to destabilizing the region and advancing their interests over other people. So if they tried it in the Middle East and they tried it in Western Europe, someday somebody's going to try that in Africa, and it's going to be devastating and destructive. And that's why we need partners from Europe and Asia and the United States working with our African partners to create the conditions of stability and growth and deterrence so nobody thinks they can get away with that in Africa.
Except Hamas is not a country.
Agreed.
Quick debate. Mr. Cromley would like to add something on that.
Wars are tragedies, simple, straightforward. But wars can create opportunities. And so in both of these cases, there will be an opportunity when we reach a point has done, where the Palestinian issue had receded as a regional priority. It's now back at the forefront of regional affairs. So, what do we do about that? Part of the forces that are working against a political solution in both cases is history. As we all have said, Vladimir Putin, is seized by the history of how the Cold War ended, and he considered that to be a catastrophe for the Soviet Union / Russia. And likewise, the Nakba is considered a catastrophe for the Palestinian people. But in both cases, the danger is that we make the perfect the enemy of the good. And so there needs to be a negotiation with respect to Ukraine that moves Ukraine clearly towards integration with Europe. And if we get stuck on the details, that will give Putin, who has a much more long-term horizon than most elected leaders in Europe, it will give him the opportunity to outlast his opponent. Question at the end of this tragedy in Gaza, it's important to keep in mind that that window is open for a very brief period of time. In terms of the why we don't have an agreement, I mean, go back to Camp David in 2000, I was there. If Yasser Arafat had said yes, we would be sitting here celebrating the 20th anniversary of a Palestinian state, and in all likelihood, the tragedy that we're seeing unfold in Gaza would not have happened. He said no because, among other reasons, he didn't feel he had the backing of the region to compromise on critical questions, one of which is the right of return. Whether you have a right of return to what is Israel today but was Palestine before 1948, or whether you have a right of return to a Palestinian state that will be separate from what is today's Israel. Those are awfully difficult questions. They have complex constituencies around them, but it is important to recognize that at the end of the day, what will solve this, what will help us avoid a tragedy going forward, is the existence of a Palestinian state. But if we can't compromise on the details of how to establish that, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, we'll be sitting on the stage talking about the next tragedy involving Israel, Hamas, with the Palestinian people in the middle.
Merci beaucoup. J'aurais peut-être deux petites dernières questions avant de laisser la parole à l'assistance. Donc, préparez des questions si vous en avez. La première pour Monsieur Lamy, et j'aimerais poursuivre dans le propos qu'évoquait Monsieur Cromley, des conflits comme opportunités. Partagez-vous cette idée que les conflits actuels doivent servir ou doivent ouvrir des opportunités? Et si oui, mais quel rôle les Européens, seuls ou en partenariat avec leurs alliés traditionnels, peuvent-ils jouer pour concrétiser ces opportunités-là?
Je crois que l'histoire nous dit que les seules paix à peu près durables ont été préparées pendant les guerres. Et donc l'idée que c'est maintenant, au beau milieu de ces atrocités, qu'il faut convoquer de bons esprits pour essayer d'esquisser la suite, c'est une idée avec laquelle je suis d'accord. Simplement, je réagis là rapidement à quelques points qui ont été dits. D'abord, il y a deux énormes incertitudes qui, à mon avis, n'ont pas encore eu leur vrai poids dans la discussion. La première, c'est la Chine. Est-ce que la Chine va continuer sa course à la puissance économique, technologique, politique, comme elle le fait? Et est-ce qu'elle va prendre la tête, ce qui est le cas aujourd'hui, de, au fond, la révolte du Sud contre le Nord? Cette question est ouverte. Si M. Trump est élu président des États-Unis, une bonne partie de notre conversation, on peut la mettre de côté et il faut en commencer une autre. J'envisage simplement, c'est désormais, ça n'est plus improbable. Hein, et ce qui compte dans la vie, c'est pas la probabilité, c'est l'espérance mathématique, c'est-à-dire le produit de la probabilité, fût-elle basse, avec le résultat qui, lui, serait considérable. Troisième point, j'ai entendu dire que M. Poutine avait perdu. Je n'en suis pas sûr. C'est trop tôt pour dire. Et d'ailleurs, ça dépendra peut-être de la réponse aux deux premières incertitudes que j'ai mentionnées. En tout cas, c'est pas ce qu'il pense, c'est pas comme ça qu'il se comporte, et c'est pas ce qu'on voit aujourd'hui pour ce que l'on voit d'une opinion russe, à la différence de ce qu'on voyait en quelque sorte il y a un an. Et enfin, dernier point, pour dire mon désaccord, pas avec tout ce qu'a dit M. Hélène Bogen, enfin pas tout à fait tout, mais avec un point qu'il a indiqué, et avec lequel je suis en profond désaccord, qui internationale, j'en ai dirigé une pendant un certain temps, c'est pas elle qui décide. Ces institutions sont le produit des membres qui les composent, c'est-à-dire des États-nations souverains. Donc dire c'est l'échec des institutions n'a aucun sens. C'est l'échec collectif des membres souverains de ces institutions qui ne sont pas parvenus à installer ou à instaurer un ordre durable. Et la racine souveraineté reste ce qui est le cas aujourd'hui sur le plan idéologique, sur le plan juridique, le constitutif de base de la société internationale, alors il faut s'en prendre aux États membres. Et au fond, les États membres, ils sont le produit, en tout cas dans les régimes dont les dirigeants ont à répondre à leurs mandants, qu'ils soient des démocraties ou autres, ce sont les peuples. Et donc on est en face de cette réalité que ce sont les peuples de cette planète qui, ensemble, et nous en font partie, ont échoué.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lamy. Peut-être un dernier mot pour Monsieur Hélène Bogen. Soit vous pouvez peut-être compléter la réponse que vous aimeriez peut-être apporter à la nuance de Monsieur Lamy, ou j'avais une question pour vous et qui apporterait quand même une réponse relativement brève, même si elle pourrait être très longue. L'une des principales préoccupations au début du conflit en cours à Gaza, c'était le risque d'escalade régionale. Comment l'évaluez-vous, ce risque, à l'heure actuelle?
I mean, let me just say I respect Mr. LeMay, but I disagree with him on this presumption that institutions aren't responsible. The fact is NATO was considered responsible for being weak, even though there were members who weren't. So I think it's more complicated, but we'll leave it there. And I do want to hear questions. As far as the implication that this is going to become, it already is a world war. We've had a world war going on for 20, 30 years. It isn't Nagasaki and Hiroshima and nuclear bombs, but it's versions of that. When you open the sarcophagus at Chernobyl for 2 weeks, as Mr. Putin did, and you spray chemical and biological elements into the air, that's a form of expansion. And the fact is, it's a hybrid war. We use the term all the time. So do I think that this could be? Yes, regrettably it is already. It isn't just a question of the United States supporting Ukraine, mostly I won't call them democracies anyway, supporting Mr. Putin on his efforts unless they have selfish interest. There are plenty of countries who have that. So my point is, yes, it's a risk you take, but frankly, and I'm sure most of the diplomats here disagree with me, I'm not one, I'm a military person, is that yes, that is a risk you have to take, and sometimes in order to learn how to live, you have to know how to die. We have forgotten that. And there are values and things that we should be prepared to I've been on the front lines for over a year now, and before then too. So yes, I'm sorry to all of you that maybe don't want to hear that, but it's you know, life and death. The minute you're born, you're dying. It's all part of the same thing, regrettably.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, on me fait signe qu'on est déjà arrivé à la fin du temps qui nous est imparti, si je comprends bien. On peut prendre peut-être une question. Oh. Alors, une question. Qui va convaincre la personne de vous donner le micro? Ne vous battez pas de conflit au cours de ce panel. Donc, ça va dépendre de vous, madame, à qui vous voulez donner le micro pour une question formulée le plus brièvement possible, s'il vous plaît.
Alors, bonjour. Ce qui est choquant dans ce panel, c'est qu'aucun d'entre vous n'a cité l'agression israélienne. Ce qui est d'autant plus choquant, c'est que vous provenez, vous êtes issu d'une forme d'élite intellectuelle et vous n'avez pas eu ni le courage, ni l'honnêteté du Hamas et le monstre de Poutine. Mais pourquoi vous n'avez pas dit, monsieur l'ami, le monstre de Netanyahou? Si la guerre avait commencé le 8 octobre 2023 et que Israël était un pays pacifique qui n'agressait pas, qui ne colonisait pas, on serait tous d'accord avec vous que Hamas avait fait effectivement une attaque terroriste. Les colons israéliens n'arrêtaient pas de tirer sur des gens qui priaient sur ce Masjid al-Aqsa. Pourquoi vous n'avez pas dit ça? Vous savez, et je finirai là-dessus, dans cette vie, on va tous mourir un jour. Et je préfère mourir avec dignité, en étant libre de dire ce que je pense, avec une objectivité, que d'être dans une telle sélectivité dans la condamnation. Merci.
Je pense que c'était sous-entendu dans le propos de chacun ici, mais peut-être quelques secondes, littéralement, si parmi vous, il y en a qui veulent apporter peut-être des clarifications aux commentaires qui viennent d'être émis. On est vraiment à la fin du temps qui nous est imparti, donc si vous voulez apporter une clarification, je vous demanderai de le faire très brièvement.
Puisque j'ai été mis en cause nommément, je réponds en une seconde sur un sujet évidemment épouvantablement compliqué. J'ai parlé d'invasion russe en Ukraine, ce qui est une réalité, et j'ai parlé d'une attaque du Hamas contre Israël, qui est une réalité. Je n'ai rien dit du droit que l'Ukraine a à se défendre, Et je n'ai rien dit du droit qu'Israël a à se défendre. Et donc, je n'ai pas le sentiment d'avoir manqué d'objectivité dans le diagnostic que nous faisons de la situation internationale. Chacun sait qui je suis, chacun connaît mes attaches et mes opinions politiques, et je fais la différence entre ce que je pense de tel ou tel gouvernement dans un pays, et notamment de celui de M. Netanyahou, et du principe de souveraineté. J'ai rappelé qu'il était le système international aujourd'hui qui donne le droit à un État qui est attaqué de se défendre. À un État qui est attaqué de se défendre.
Manifestement, notre discussion a suscité pas mal de débats. Mon nom est Julien Toureil, je vous remercie. Merci à toutes et à tous. Je vous souhaite un après-midi reposant et une bonne discussion. Merci.